Solomonster here, back from Florida and Royal Rumble weekend for a quick recap of the Undertaker 1 Deadman show, which took place at the Capitol Theater in Clearwater, Florida. This was the night after the Royal Rumble, and got to take in the show. It was added kind of last minute, I would say maybe about a month or so before the Rumble. They decided to add another Undertaker stage show. He's been doing these for a couple of years now, and this one was held at the Capitol Theater in Clearwater, which is an intimate venue, probably has a capacity of around 700 or so people, and it was pretty packed. And what it is what they describe as an intimate experience where The Undertaker will share never-before-heard stories, which is not totally true because the vast majority of what he talked about are stories that I have heard before. There might have been a couple of things in there, but overall it was an enjoyable experience. It was fun. If it's something that you have considered doing or would consider doing in the future, it's pretty tight, about 90 minutes long. It actually started right on time, which shocked the hell out of me. We were still getting inside, and I could hear the music because they were playing his theme music and everything, and there he was already on stage. So normally these things might be a few minutes before it kicks off. He kicked off right on time. And we got in, we took our seats, we're probably fourth row on the side. And it's Undertaker on stage, and he's standing up for the duration of it. He's kind of pacing and walking back and forth on stage with the mic in his hand. It's not him taking a seat or anything like that. He likes to move around, and he's moving around pretty good for a guy who had a double knee replacement last April, as he told us. But on the whole, it was a fun experience. If you are going into this expecting or hoping that he will be running down stories from his career in chronological order and taking you through how he got into wrestling in the early days of The Undertaker, through the Attitude Era and everything that came later on, and he's going to regale you with stories about his feud with Kane and his Hell in a Cell match with Mankind and stuff like that, none of that was even mentioned. That's not what this show is. It basically is, and I'm sure he's got a quick rundown of the key stuff he wants to talk about. Some of it might be off the cuff, but it really is just a kind of an amalgamation of different stories that he thinks are funny. Stories from the BSK crew, and his experiences with his buddies on the road. And then there's a Q&A portion at the end where they pitch it to people in the crowd. And all the people that got to ask questions were they were consolidated into those first, I'd say, 3 rows. 3 or 4 rows. I think those might be the people that paid a bundle for those tickets. And so they had the opportunity to submit questions either in advance or they kind of had a sense of maybe what they were going to ask about. So it wasn't like they opened it up to everybody in the theater, or else maybe I would have asked a couple of questions. But nonetheless, that's the format for the event. So you don't go into it expecting that he's going to be covering his entire career, because you will be left disappointed if that is what you are expecting to see. I came in here with no expectations. I didn't read any reviews from past shows that he's done. He did a show in Vegas not that long ago that he told us about that kind of went off the rails when he had The Godfather on stage, another one of his BSK buddies, who is based out there in Vegas. And I guess at the time, Godfather had just gotten a hip replacement. And so he was, maybe a little under the influence of certain drugs in the time that followed his operation. And so he was on stage and he was saying all kinds of stuff. And Undertaker was joking that the whole thing went off the rails. But if you are wondering if he told any Vince McMahon stories, there was not a single mention of Vince McMahon during the show. And I'm sure that were it not for the story that came out this past week and the lawsuit and the allegations, we would have gotten Vince McMahon stories on this show. There was not a single Vince McMahon mention. The closest thing was there was a point during the show where he started to tell a story about a woman. He stopped himself. It was kind of like he joked indirectly about the Vince stuff and said, "Oh, yeah, we better not do that." And he kind of shied away from it. But that was the closest that he came to anything Vince related. But if you are wondering, hey, I wonder, did he tell any Vince stories? No. And I suspect that he will not be going forward at any of these shows, especially if there's, WWE is hosting these. I would imagine that there's going to be some stuff that they're not going to want to talk about. But he did have a special guest in the front row that he pointed out, and then he invited him onto the stage, and that was Dennis Knight. Now, the name Dennis Knight may not mean anything to you, but he was, at first, Phineas Godwinn, and then later on, Mideon in WWE. Mideon from the corporate ministry, and then, of course, Naked Mideon, which I have tried to put out of my mind as much as possible. But he spent a number of years in WWE. He was very good friends with The Undertaker, part of the whole BSK, Bone Street crew that they had there behind the scenes. He invited him up onto the stage, and, he looks the same except for the fact that he's bald these days. But he had him up on stage and gave him the chance to talk for a little bit and explain that he had gotten out of the wrestling business early in the 2000s, and he had retired, and he got into, I think, culinary school. He became a chef. He became a chef, which is what he's been doing now for over 20 years. He's a professional chef. Started his own catering company, I believe. And I was aware of the fact that he had suffered a very serious accident on the job a number of years ago where there was some sort of apparatus that had dropped on his foot. And because he has issues with his spine, he doesn't have any feeling, and this is according to him, he doesn't have any feeling in his lower legs. So like below the knee, he can't feel much. And so he had dropped something very, very heavy on his foot in the kitchen and caused some severe damage, but he was not aware of it because he can't feel anything. It wasn't until he got home, and this was maybe an hour later, that he said he took his feet felt kind of swollen or his foot felt swollen, but he took his sock off and he could see like some of his toes were hanging off. There was one toe that was in the sock. I mean, really just, gory stuff. And then he went to the hospital and they had to treat him for an infection. Anyway, long story short, they end up cutting off all the toes on his foot. And now it's almost like a slipper, when he puts his socks on and stuff. He's got no toes on that foot. I mean, you hear about stuff like that when somebody has diabetes and they have circulatory issues, but in this case, it was from an accident. And he's able to walk. I mean, you would never know. It's not like he limped onto the stage. But I had heard that story previously. Clearly, people in the theater had not, because they were shocked and appalled by this when he told the story. Undertaker jokes now he calls him Flipper. So that's his new nickname for Mideon. But anyway, so he told the story about his foot. He stayed on stage for a while. And if I had one critique of this show, I mean, I had fun. I thought overall it was a fun way to spend 90 minutes, but we probably got a little too much Mideon on this show. I mean, he was on stage for a while. And Undertaker was telling various stories about him, and, one story from many years ago when he invited him over to his house, and he ended up, whatever it was that he was drinking or doing, he came downstairs one day, he heard this weird noise, and there's Mideon, and he had basically painted the walls and painted everything with vomit, and that was not a fun time. But again, it was just a lot of like, I'm looking, going, all right, we've had enough Mideon. I'm here for The Undertaker. I'm not here for fucking Mideon here. So eventually he got off the stage. Undertaker resumed telling some stories. He told a Macho Man Randy Savage story from after he and Elizabeth had split. This was in the early 90s, and he was really down. He was in a deep hole. And it was Undertaker and Bryan Adams, Crush, who tried to cheer him up. They were very good friends. Bryan Adams and Randy Savage were actually very close friends. And they feuded going into WrestleMania 10. They had that match. So Taker and Bryan Adams were really trying to cheer him up. And he told one story about how they took Savage to a strip club in Alaska, of all places. A place called the ABC Club. He said the ABC Club stood for the Alaskan Bush Company. Some of the most beautiful women he had ever seen, because there were a lot of oil workers there who had a lot of money to spend. And so they went to the ABC Club, and when they got to the airport the next day, and there they see Savage coming, he had a pep in his step, and his whole demeanor had changed. And he joked, he said he did a Savage impression, and said Savage said, that was the best 90 seconds of my life. So anyway, that was his, and I was curious about this. I said, interesting, the ABC Club. I looked it up, and it is actually a real place. It is the Great Alaskan Bush Company. And it is a real gentleman's club in Anchorage, Alaska. So I looked it up, that for research purposes, of course, just to see that if it is real and it is still something that exists. So the answer is yes. And then he just got into some, small random stories. Again, I was waiting to see if he was going to talk more about the early days being in WWE and tell stories about working with some people. And not the same, stories that we always hear about what it's like to work with this guy and that guy. But, stories from that era that maybe we haven't heard before. And there wasn't too much of that. He did make an interesting comment at one... Well, actually, every time he brought up his ex-wives, he referred to them as his mistakes. So he would refer to them as mistake number 1 when I was with mistake number 2. That was another common theme throughout the show. But there was one point where he made a comment, and I don't remember what it was in relation to. Maybe it came during the Q&A portion. But he said, WWE business right now has never been hotter, and he doesn't understand why. And he's not trying to knock the current roster and the men and women, that they have working for them right now. But he thinks about the way they did things back in the day and back during the Attitude Era, and what a big time that was for wrestling and a very popular period. But he says, for whatever reason, business right now for WWE has never been hotter. And you could tell just based on the way, he wasn't trying to insult the current roster, but he genuinely doesn't understand as he watches the product. What my impression of what he was saying is he watches it, and when he does, he doesn't really understand what there is about it that would make it as hot as it is. And the reason that the product, in part, is as hot as it is business-wise, it has a lot to do with, obviously, the money they're making from their rights deals. We just heard about this huge 10-year, $5 billion deal they signed with Netflix, and that's just for Raw. That's to say nothing of the other deals they have for SmackDown and NXT, and they're very reliant on that television money that they are bringing in. That's one of the reasons why they have so much freaking money right now. As far as the product itself and why it seems to be so popular, there could be any number of reasons for that, but they're a content creation company now. So even if you think that the creative and what you're seeing on the television shows, and maybe Undertaker is tuning in every now and then to an episode of Raw, I doubt he sits there and watches all 3 hours. He'd bang his head against the wall. But he probably tunes in and watches it and says, what is it about what they're doing right now that makes the product so hot? The reason they're making so much money is they're just pumping out content as much as they can. They're a content creation company, and it almost doesn't even matter if the product is boring, in your opinion, or if the product is hot and it's exciting and you love the stories and it's so interesting. It almost doesn't even matter. Because all they need to do is put their 3 hours of television out every Monday and their 2 hours on Friday, their 1 hour on Tuesday. They have a YouTube channel. They're constantly pumping out content there. They do documentaries and they do videos on Peacock. They're a content creation company. The more content they create, people like that. They're willing to pay for it. Content is king. When you look at it through that lens, you can understand why they're doing so well right now. A big part of that is the fact that it's just they're pumping out so much fucking content. It almost doesn't even matter what the quality of it is, right? The more they produce, the more money they make. But even Undertaker is like, I don't know. I can't tell you why it's so hot, but it is. Business is booming. Now, he did take audience questions towards the end, and I'm sure they were carefully vetted. There were no controversial questions, if you were wondering if somebody would hit him with one of those about something. But he was asked about his heat with Hulk Hogan. Any heat still, residual heat with Hogan. Of course, if you don't know that story, that goes back to their match from the Survivor Series in 1991, when Undertaker dropped him on his head for a tombstone, and Hogan sold it like he really had his neck jammed or broken. And it is a funny thing to hear Undertaker tell the story in the past, where Hogan gets to the back and he's laying on the ground. He's telling somebody, get Linda and the kids on the phone, like he's fucking dying over here. Even Shane McMahon looks over at Undertaker that night and goes, his head never hit. which Undertaker didn't know until a couple of days later at TV. He saw a tape and realized his head never came close to hitting, and he confronted Hogan about it too. And Hogan was like, "Oh, brother, my neck got jammed, brother," But it was from that moment on, Undertaker knew what Hogan was all about, and he had no love lost for him. He just didn't like the guy. And probably still doesn't like the guy. But in response to the question, he said, right now, there's no heat. He has learned over time as he has gotten older that there's no sense in holding on to that kind of stuff. So at this moment right now, it's not about hatred. It's not about having heat. He goes, as far as he's concerned, he and Hogan are cool. He even answered a question later on about who his Mount Rushmore of wrestlers would be, and he had Hogan on the list. Which, how could he not be, right, when you consider his place in history? But his Mount Rushmore is Andre the Giant, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, and Stone Cold Steve Austin. And he says he bases that on their influence in the business. And he said he would put Rock kind of on the back end of that. But that would be his Mount Rushmore. He was asked a question of all of his colleagues and friends who are no longer with us, who's the one that he misses the most? And he mentioned Yokozuna, who he was very tight with. And then he got very emotional, and he paused for a bit, and then he said Bryan Adams. And part of the reason he got very emotional, he pointed out that in the front row, actually sitting right next to Mideon, was Bryan's oldest son. He was at the show. So those were the two that he says he misses the most. He answered a question about Bray Wyatt. Somebody asked him about Bray. What was it about Bray that he liked or that kind of drew him to Bray? Because Undertaker has always spoken very glowingly about Bray Wyatt. And it was a year ago, right around this time, almost to the day, at that Raw 30 show, that they had that moment that they shared in the ring. It was brief, but they had that segment with Undertaker and Bray Wyatt and LA Knight. And at the very end of it, Undertaker whispers something in Bray's ear. And that was only a year ago. And now, of course, Bray is no longer with us anymore. And he said, he loved Bray. And the thing he loved the most about Bray Wyatt is that he thought outside the box. He goes, there's so many guys in wrestling, guys, girls, whatever. There's so many people who will look at how the top stars do things. They'll look at how they do things, how they say things, and they'll just want to emulate them because they look at them and they think, well, it's working for them, so they must be doing something right. I'll just do what he's doing, or I'll just do what she's doing. And he said Bray wasn't like that. He did his own thing. He thought outside the box. He was a very creative guy. And you could just tell as you listen to him talk about Bray, you can hear it in his voice, the respect that he had for him and how, he saw big things in his future and unfortunately that was just not meant to be. He did mention that he had both of his knees replaced in April of last year. He did them at the same time, which he does not recommend doing. He said those first few weeks was just hell on earth. But he's actually walking upright now, he said. And then he got a question from a fan from Kuwait about the Vader incident, which is a famous incident where they were over there in the Middle East. They were promoting a show they were having in Kuwait that night. It was actually going to be Undertaker and Vader in the main event. And they were on a very popular, it might have been the #1 morning show over there at the time. Vader got a question about wrestling that he didn't appreciate very much. He felt that he and the wrestling business was being disrespected. And he spoke up about it and grabbed the host by his tie and pulled him in. The guy felt very threatened. Undertaker is just sitting there the entire time with his shades on, the belt in his lap. He's motionless. He's emotionless. And he said that even though he's sitting there and he's devoid of any emotion, he's thinking the entire time, Leon, don't do it. Don't do it. Ah, shit, he did it. And Vader got in a lot of hot water for that. He had to spend at least another week, I think it was, in Kuwait, even after everybody left and went home. He was detained there for a while. I think he might have been detained in the consulate, whatever it was. But it was a little dicey there, and they played it up on TV like it was some big international incident. So he talked a little bit about that. Of course, he got the obligatory question, about having one more match, even though he had just talked about why he would never have another match. It's not going to stop people from asking the question anyway. And he said that he would love to have one more match. He goes, if it were up to him and his body could cooperate, he'd be in the ring right now. It kills him that he can't do it anymore, but his body, he goes, Father Time is undefeated. And This is something he said in his documentary on Peacock when they did that whole series of episodes some time ago. But he said that he does not want to be in a position where a father takes his son to the show to see The Undertaker. Oh, you got to see this guy. This guy's great. And they go to see The Undertaker and he's less than. And the son doesn't understand what's so special about the guy. And the father looks over at him and says, man, you should have seen him when he was good. And he doesn't want to be that guy. And he even admitted he may have stayed a little too long, even as it is. But he never wanted to be that guy. So if he can't go in there and do the things that he used to do, then he's not interested in doing it. But if it were up to him, and his body could still go, even at 50-something years old, he would still be in the ring. He never would have retired. But he understands that. He just can't do it anymore. And it was always Vince McMahon, really, who was coming to him and saying, hey, how about one more? And he's talked about, looking at Vince like a father figure, so he would do it. Now with Vince not around anymore, I don't think anybody's going to be picking up the phone and calling The Undertaker, asking him to get back in the ring, because he's got no business being in the ring. So I don't think we need to worry about that. And that was really the gist of it. It was a very laid-back kind of thing. He had a table on stage with a bottle of Jack, and Mideon would do shots every now and then. And even after Mideon got off the stage, he'd go over there and grab a drink here and there. And yeah, the audience was fine. There were a couple of hecklers in there who were shouting things, and he would joke and tell them to shut up, or everybody would cheer. But for the most part, everybody behaved themselves. And it was just a fun way to spend 90 minutes. Yeah, I wouldn't go into this, again, thinking that you're going to get the man's life story. That's not what this is for. And I wouldn't spend too much money on tickets to this. I'm sure there were people who spent hundreds of dollars. I mean, I wouldn't do that. But if they come to town and you're thinking, hey, is it worth checking out? I would say if you can get a ticket at a reasonable price, or if you're an Undertaker fan, you'll enjoy it. And clearly he's gotten more comfortable the more of these that he has done. So that's my recap of the Undertaker One Deadman show to cap off a fun Royal Rumble weekend. Go check out all the other Royal Rumble weekend content that's up here on the channel and my live Rumble review if you missed it. And check out all the other content on the channel as well. We just passed 77,000 subscribers, so thank you for that. And I'll see you guys back here real soon.